When people ask me what I do, I tend to tell them that I make lines go through dots. And in a general sense, that's kind of what we do. And so this is, what I'm trying to show you here is the general problem that we're trying to address. Basically, if we have a model, this can be either an algebraic model or a dynamic model. What we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out the combination of parameters that will best fit the predictions of the model to the observations. And so as sort of an example, we have concentration effect data shown here to the right. And with this concentration effect data, what we want to do is we want to be able to determine, in this case, the Emax and the EC50 of this system, which will best fit our data. So in this case, Emax and EC50 represent our collection of parameters, theta. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to minimize in some way the deviation between the measured and the predicted values. In order to do this, what we normally do is we try to formulate this as an optimization problem. So in a mathematical sense, what we're trying to do is we're trying to define this objective function, which changes with respect to our parameters. And by minimizing the sum-squared error in this case, we're trying to find the set of parameters which minimizes our objective function. Now, depending on the types of problems, and what this means is that depending on the type of objective and the different equations which constrain the system, there are different ways to solve these problems. Okay? But there's only a very few general ways to solve any problem. Okay? So if you have a bunch of linear equations, linear constraints on your system, and you want to solve a problem where you're trying to maximize some linear combination of those parameters, then there are linear programming methodologies, which are very, very fast and very, very efficient. But they only work in a very select and specific set of instances. Now, more generally, if we want to solve any type of problem, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to use some sort of gradient-based method. And so this is the type of problem. This is the types of methods that you will have to use if you want to solve nonlinear programming problems. A nonlinear programming problem is any problem that has a nonlinear objective function, as in this case, where we're squaring our variables, or nonlinear constraints, as in this case, where our model is a nonlinear combination of our parameters. I think that to illustrate how this works, what we can do is we can consider a two-compartment system. Okay. If we have a two-compartment system and we've fixed all of the parameters here with the exception of clearance. So all of the parameters here with the exception of clearance are fixed, and we start out with some initial guess for clearance. Okay, so our initial guess here is A. Okay. At A, what we can do is we can calculate each of the individual residuals. So R1, R2, all the way up through Rn. And when we calculate these residuals, that's going to give us an objective function value. Okay, and our objective function value here is the sum-squared error. Okay. And as we adjust clearance, so as we shift either left or right, we're going to either increase or decrease our objective function value. Okay. The way that the gradient-based methods work is they take the derivative of the objective function with respect to the parameters, and they try to drive that derivative to 0. This is analogous to function minimization in calculus, where you would take the derivative, set it equal to 0, and you would find all of the roots to that derivative. And when you found the roots, that was either going to be a maximum, a minimum, or a point of inflection. Now, if we evaluate the derivative at some specific point, so in this case, if we take our clearance at A and we evaluate the derivative, okay, the tangent to this objective function is going to have a slope that's negative. Okay. We can say that the tangent evaluated at this point A is going to push us away from the minimum. That's what this is. The partial derivative of the sum-squared error with respect to the clearance is going to point us away from the minimum. So if we take the negative, that's going to point us in the opposite direction. So the negative of a negative is going to give us a positive. And the gradient, in this case, is just the negative of the derivative of the objective function with respect to clearance. Okay? And what this does is this tells us the direction in which we need to step in order to minimize our system. So if you look at this picture over here, or this diagram, we'll see that our model prediction is consistently above our data. This would indicate that our clearance is too low. Okay? And if we evaluate the derivative and we take the negative, that's going to point us to an increase in clearance. Now, depending on the optimization routine you use, ADAPT uses the Needler-Mead simplex method. It's going to take us a step forward in clearance. The distance is going to depend on the specific algorithm that's being used, but it's going to increase your clearance. So if we take a step forward and that brings us to B, what we'll see is that we have decreased the residual error, we have increased the clearance, and we've decreased our objective function value here. Now, if we kept stepping forward in time, eventually what we would do is we would get to our optimal solution. Okay? So if you look at our optimal solution, we'll see that the residual error has been significantly decreased at our optimal solution, designated as C. And if we look, we see that the change in the derivative of the objective function with respect to clearance is going to be equal to 0. Something to note here is that because we're using a gradient-based method, there can be other minima in the system. So there's multiple minima, and there's actually multiple maximum values as well. And so one of the problems we get is when we start an optimization, if we have poor initial guesses, those poor initial guesses may lead us to local minima, and these local minima will result in poor model fits. Okay? So these are things to keep in mind. So there's one of the reasons why other optimization routines might be used for specific types of problems is that they can guarantee global optimality in this case, whereas most nonlinear optimization routines cannot guarantee global optimality. So what we need to do is, if we want to perform parameter estimation, we want to be able to perform some sort of function minimization. MATLAB provides many different function minimization routines, and these come with, I believe, the optimization toolbox in MATLAB. I've listed a few here, but the one that I tend to prefer to use is called fmin-search. And fmin-search it says here, is a multi-parameter, unconstrained nonlinear optimization routine. So it's a very generic routine. It uses some form of the Needler-Mead simplex algorithm as well, which is what ADAPT uses. And my experience is that generally this function is slower, but it tends to provide better estimates. And because the computer's time isn't really that expensive to me, I tend to just let the computer kind of go crazy and try as hard as it can. And then I come back and I look at the results. And so the others that I've listed here are fmin-UNC, which is a multi-parameter unconstrained optimization, and fmin-con, which is a multi-parameter constrained optimization. They're generally faster, but they tend to provide poor results. You can incorporate constraints into fmin-search. It's a little tricky, but that's possible as well. And then they have least squares optimizers. So if you want to do like a least squares estimation, you can use LSQ nonlan or LSQ curve fit. But for the bulk of all the examples shown here, we're going to use fmin-search as our optimization routine within MATLAB. In order to perform an optimization within MATLAB, we have to have some sort of objective function. And the scripts and functions that I'm going to provide you provide two possible objective functions. We have the weighted least squares objective function, and we have the negative log likelihood objective function. Okay, so remember here that W here are weights. These could be fixed values if we have some idea of assay error, or you could just use the inverse of y squared, or y. Y sub I of t is going to be your actual data, and y hat is going to be your model prediction. Okay. So weighted least squares basically just provide you a way to weight the importance of the individual estimates. And then negative log likelihood tries to simultaneously minimize both your deviation from your predicted versus your observations, and it also tries to minimize simultaneously the variance And in this case, you can model the variance any way you want. And we'll talk about the details of that in a minute. So these are the two objective function values that my scripts will allow you to use. If you don't want to use weights, you can just set the weighting values to 1 for all of them, and then that basically turns your weighted least squares problem into a sum squared error problem. So now we should talk a little bit about weights, because I don't know that this is always that what we're going to discuss here is always very apparent, or if it's explicitly stated enough. But when you use when nonlin, you can specify weights, and at adapt you can model the variance, and these two concepts are intrinsically related. And this can be seen when you compare on the previous objective. If you compare the coefficient of the weighted least squares objective with the coefficient of the negative log likelihood objective, we see that the weights are actually equal to the inverse of the variance. Okay? So in a simple sense, then our weights are going to be equal to, say, the inverse of the predicted values squared, or if we wanted to, we can model the variance, and we can model the weights as well. So these concepts are interrelated. It's important to understand that. So this is a flow chart, and the purpose of this flow chart is to show you how fmin search works with different components of the optimization routine. So basically, fmin search is a built-in MATLAB function, and it's going to take essentially it's going to take minimally it has to accept an initial guess for your parameters. Okay, so it's going to take your initial guess for your parameters, and it's going to send different parameters to what a function I've called here calculate objective. Okay, so what calculate objective is going to do is it's going to simulate your system forward in time for a given set of parameters, and then it's going to receive the output, and based on the output of your model or your model predictions and your actual data, it's going to calculate some objective function value. And so what fmin search is going to do is it's going to manipulate your parameters until it minimizes this value. So this is a flow chart, and this is a flow of information. So there's basically three functions that are operating here. You have fmin search, which is a built-in MATLAB function, and you have calculate objective, and you have simulate, and these two things are functions that I've created. So I've created a function to simulate my system forward in time, and I've created a function that will take my simulated values and compare them to my observed results and calculate some objective function value. So this is how we're going to fit the exposure response data that I showed you originally. So if we go into the directory that was listed on the previous slide called estimate_emax, I have created data for the system, and I've stored them in data.mat, and it contains the concentration data. These are the data that were plotted earlier, and it also contains the variable original_parameters, and so these are the original parameters that I used to generate these data. I have an M file, which is a function called simulate.m, and what simulate.m does is it takes as its input either a vector of concentrations and drug concentrations and the parameters, params, and it calculates my effect. It calculates my predicted effect for those specific concentrations and a given set of parameters. Okay, and this file is going to sort of represent my model. Okay, so this is my this is a very simple model, but I think it's here to illustrate sort of the process of optimization in MATLAB. So next, what we need to do is we need to be able to calculate the changes in our objective function with respect to any given set of parameters. So what we've done is, what I've done is I've created this function called calculate_objective.m. This takes in one variable called parameters, and it returns the value of the objective function. And the value in the objective function that we're using in this case is simply a sum squared error. So let's walk through this function to understand it. Okay, so the first line is my function declaration. Then what we do is we load the data from the data.mat file, and I'm just loading the concentration effect data. So I'm only loading one value. Next we need to get our predicted values. So predicted here is going to be the result of our simulated. So we're simulating, we're sending in the concentration from the concentration effect data and the set of parameters that was sent into calculate objective. And then what I do here is I go through and I get the size, in this case, is a built-in MATLAB function, and it returns the number of rows and number of columns. And I initialize my objective function value here at 0, and then what I do is I basically just loop through all of the different rows in the concentration effect data, and I calculate my sum squared error. I just keep adding those values to value. So value is equal to the previous value plus the sum of the sum squared error for this particular row. Okay, so this is going to return my total sum squared error for all of the data. Now, to perform the estimation routine, I have to use I have a script here. The script is called estimate_parameters.m. The first thing I do is I clear my workspace, remove any variables that have been created, and then I have to create some sort of initial guess. So guess here is going to be 110. Okay. So this is the Emax and this is the EC50. And then I have set some options here. So what I'm doing is I'm setting my options for my estimation. So OptimSet sets different options for fmin search and then the different optimization routines within MATLAB. And I'm basically saying that I want to display the iteration. So I want it to display something at each iteration. And I'm going to store the solution in solution.parameters. And here I call fmin search. And the first thing that I have to send into fmin search is my objective function handle. Okay, so this is just the name of my objective function with a little @ symbol in front of it. This indicates that it's a function handle. If I just put in calculate_objective, it would look for a variable called calculate_objective and evaluate that for a function name. The next thing I send in is my initial guess, and then I send in the options that I created above. What this is going to do is it's going to go through and it's going to minimize my objective function, and then it's going to save the solution in solution.mat. So it's going to save the variable solution in solution.mat. And then after I've generated after I've found my solution, I can plot the results, and I'm plotting the results in the file called plot_results.m. Okay, so here we see the actual predictions. So the black line is the predictions using the actual parameters. The blue line are the predictions using the estimated parameters, and here we can see the original Emax was 44.4, and then my estimate was 43.45. My original EC50 was 20.8, and my estimated value was 19.94. So that is a simple example of how to perform parameter estimation within MATLAB using a very simple objective function value. So what we could do is we can run these scripts so that you can see how they work. First, we're going to estimate the parameters. So I type estimate parameters and I hit enter. And what you'll see if we scroll up is originally what's going to be displayed is the iteration of the estimation, the number of function evaluations used so far, and the minimum objective function that we currently have. And then this procedure is the internal workings. It represents the internal workings of fmin search. So as we increase the number of iterations, or as the iterations increase, we also see that the number of function evaluations increases, and we see our objective function decreasing accordingly. And then eventually it gets down to a pretty low number, and then it just stays there. Okay? And eventually what it does is it terminates according to some sort of criteria. Now you can change or adjust these criteria if you want. That's possible. And these are different options that you can set within the OptimSet command. Now what we can do is we can plot the results. And this plots both the results and the data by themselves as well. And these are the results that we saw in the presentation. So next what I want to do is I want to take this opportunity, because this is a fairly simple example in that we're optimizing a function that has only 2 parameters. And because it has only 2 parameters, we can actually visualize the objective function. So what I've done here is I've generated a surface plot in MATLAB, and this is the surface plot of the objective function. So this is the sum squared error on the z-axis here. And then on the y-axis we have the changes in EC50, and on the x-axis we have changes in Emax. Okay. This represents the surface of the objective function here. And then what I've done is I've created a contour of the objective function. So this is sort of like a topographical map of the objective function below it, so that you can see the rings of constant objective function value. And then I've also plotted it to the side so that you can kind of better visualize the objective function. What we have here is we have two different points that are identified. One point is the actual parameters used. Okay, so the red dot here represents the actual parameters used to generate the data. Now keep in mind these data have noise added to them, so to give us a more realistic problem to solve, we had added noise to the data. And so the objective function doesn't really understand that there's noise in these data. All it knows is that it's trying to minimize some function. And the green dot represents the estimated parameters. So you can see that the estimated parameters pretty much lie right where we would expect the minimum to lie. So we've got a pretty good handle on the estimate. And we can look in this area and we can see that there's no other local, or at least there doesn't appear to be any other local minima involved. Okay, so the difference here between the green dot and the red dot is associated with the noise that was added to the data. Okay, and if you want to generate this figure yourself, you can use the command plot_objective, and it'll generate this entire figure for you. So we started off by looking at just modifying clearance, and that showed us how our objective function changed in one dimension. And then now we looked at just modifying two parameters, so the EC50 and the Emax, and optimizing the EC50 and the Emax to fit the exposure response data. And this shows us how our objective function changes in 2 dimensions. Now, this is pretty much as far as we can go in terms of visualizing our objective function, because most of our systems are going to be far more complicated than the 1- and 2-dimensional examples we've looked at so far. In fact, most of our systems are going to they're going to have multiple dimensions, but hopefully this explains the mathematics behind parameter estimation and and it gives you a feel for what objective functions are and how they relate to the parameters that you're trying to estimate. What I showed you in the previous slide, how to calculate the exposure, how to estimate the exposure response parameters, was a very specific example of how to use fmin search and how to get parameter estimates. But it doesn't really necessarily work in a very generic way. And so what I've done is I've gone through and I've created a generic framework for performing an analysis. And this figure here, while it may look a little confusing at first, is sort of represents the flow of information in this analysis. So most of my scripts for performing a parameter estimation are called analysis.m. Okay, so these are just scripts for managing the estimation, the generation of solution statistics, and the plotting of the results. Okay. The analysis basically consists of 2 major components. Okay, so the pink boxes here show us the first thing we want to do is we want to find the estimates of our parameters. And then based on those estimates of our parameters, we're going to calculate the solution statistics about those estimates. Okay. So what we have here is we're using fmin search to calculate our parameter estimates. This is going to call a function called calculate objective, which is a function that I've written. This is a function that you should not have to edit yourself, so you shouldn't have to change this. Calculate objective is going to send a set of parameters and a variable that you're going to create in analysis called cfg. So cfg is going to contain all the components associated with managing your analysis. Okay, so you send in cfg and guess, an initial guess for your parameters, and fmin search. Fmin search is going to pass not just your initial guess, but any changes to your initial guess in order to minimize your objective function, and cfg down to calculate objective. Calculate objective is then going to calculate a value and send that back to fmin search. The way that calculate objective calculates a value is it sends that set of parameters in cfg to observation details. Observation details is a function that you have to create as a user, and what that does is it sends back a data structure called observations, and observations is expected to have a very specific format, and this observations data structure will contain the observation times, it will contain the actual observations, it will contain the model predictions of your observations at those specified times, and it will also contain some model of your variance. Okay. This is where the simulation portion of this workshop kind of comes into play, because you have to be able to run your simulation and evaluate your simulation at the time points where you have observations. Okay, so then basically observation details is going to have to call run simulation generic, and then run simulation generic is going to have to call a Simulink model, and it's also going to have to call your C file as a result. Okay. So this is the parameter estimation stage. After the parameter estimates have been found, fmin search is going to return those parameters, and the parameters and the CFG variable that you've created will then be sent into a function called solution statistics. Okay? And this is a function that I've created that will generate solution statistics based on your observation details file that you're going to have to create as a user. It's going to create those solution statistics, and then it's going to return this data structure called solution underscore stats. This will contain the CV percents. It will contain your 95% confidence interval, AIC, BIC, that type of information will be contained in the solution stats data structure. So this is the important part of analysis.m. Further, after finding the parameter estimates and calculating solution statistics, you can then go on to generate figures and different outputs and whatever graphical information you need to sort of validate what you're doing. In order to use fmin search, we need to talk about how fmin search sort of works, or what it's expecting. And by default, fmin search is going to expect 3 different inputs. Okay. The first input, as we've seen already, is a function handle. Okay. The second input is going to be your initial guess, and then the third input is going to be the optimizations, the optimization options that you've created using the optimset built-in MATLAB function. If you have no options, then you can always just put in an open square bracket, close square bracket, and that'll just kind of be a placeholder, but it won't send any information in. And the objective function that you're calling is expected to have at least one input. Okay, the objective function is going to expect the first input to be a set of parameters. So for any given set of parameters, your objective function needs to be able to calculate the value of your objective function. Okay. So those parameters will then be passed on down to your observation details function. Now, we need to be able to specify more information. For example, we need to be able to send into your observation details file possibly data, right? So that you can format your observations data structure correctly. So you want to put the data in that as well. The way that this is done is everything that fmin search is sent after the options is passed directly on to calculate objective. So calculate objective will have parameters as its first input, but then everything after options will then be passed on. So in this case, I have input 2, input 3, and input 4. Input 2 is actually the 4th input to fmin search. Input 3 is actually the 5th input to fmin search, and input 4 is actually the 6th input to fmin search. These will then be passed directly to calculate objective. Okay, so in this example, input 2 is the 4th input to input search, but the 2nd input to the objective function. So this is how the CFG variable is passed from the analysis.m workspace down through fmin search, down to calculate objective, and then further, then it's passed down further to your observation details file that you're going to have to create yourself. What calculate objective does is for any given set of parameters and a set of observations, it's going to calculate the objective function, and you can either calculate the weighted least squares objective function or the negative log likelihood objective function, and we'll discuss how this is implemented in a moment. This function should not be changed. You should never change this function. Okay. Solution statistics is a function that's going to calculate different statistics at the parameter estimates. So this is going to give you your CV%, your confidence interval, your AIC, all that stuff. Again, this function should never be changed. These two should just work. The last thing you need to be concerned about is observation details. Okay, so this is very similar to the simulation driver that you were using to drive your simulations when we were discussing how to simulate ordinary differential equations. Okay? But instead of simulating smooth continuous outputs, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to simulate the system forward in time at the points of measurement. So wherever you have observations, that's where you want to be able to evaluate your simulation. And this is also where you're going to calculate the variance at these points as well. Okay, and these are going to be stored again in the observations data structure. We'll describe the details of that in a moment, but this is a function that you as a user are going to have to create in order to use these routines. Okay, to understand the parameter estimation paradigm here, what I've done is I'm going to go back to the two-compartment model with a bolus as a case study. Okay, so recall that we have this two-compartment model, and it's parameterized in terms of the K12, K21 microconstants. And so we have basically 4 parameters, and we have a bolus occurring at time 0 with a magnitude of 500 units. We have one output in this case, it's the plasma concentration, and I have stored the data for this in data.mat. The data has the data.mat file has a variable called data. It has 2 fields, CPAll, which is the plasma concentrations of all the subjects. So there's 10 subjects and 7 measurements per subject. And then the sample times. These are the times at which these subjects were sampled. I said before that we have this variable called CFG. CFG is a data structure, and CFG has an expected set of fields. Okay, some of these are going to be required, and some of them are going to be optional. I understand that it may be confusing at times to determine like once you first get started with MATLAB, it may be confusing to understand these things. So what I've done is I've created an M file called check_cfg.m, and what this can be used is you run check_cfg with CFG as an argument, and it'll look through CFG and look at the data structure of CFG, look at the different fields, look at their contents, and try to tell you if there's any problems with it. Okay, and if you want to know, if you're looking for one location where you can determine the format for CFG, you look at the help for check_cfg, and it'll describe in detail what's being discussed here. So there are 2 different fields in CFG that are going to be used for estimation. Okay, so these are going to be required. You're going to have a parameters field, okay, and this is going to contain information about both your system and your variance parameters, their upper bounds, their lower bounds, the initial guesses. You'll put the names of the parameters in this field. We also have the estimation field, and this is going to specify things like your type of objective function and how you want to handle timeouts and different information about the estimation being performed. Okay, so these are fields that the calculate objective function and the solution statistics function are going to be looking at for information on how to perform the estimation and how to calculate solution statistics. Next we have user-defined fields. So we can have you can create your own data field if you want. So you can have a cfg.data field, and what I normally do is I put all of my observation data into this field, and I put information about times, I put information about different measurements, units, I put everything in this cfg.data field. And then if you want to manage your estimation routine on your own, like if you want to add conditional statements within within the observation details function that you're creating and whatnot, you can stick all of that information in cfg.options. So this is a both of these, the cfg.options and cfg.data, are user-defined fields, and you can create them in any format you want that makes sense to you. So you can create them however you want as long as you understand what it is that you're doing. but you have a lot of freedom here. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the different fields in CFG so that we can talk about what's required and how these things work. So if we look at the parameters field of CFG, we see that it's also a data structure, and it contains several different fields as well. Okay. Names is a cell array, and this is a cell array that contains the names of your different parameters. So it's going to have a length equal to the number of system parameters plus the number of variance parameters. In fact, all of these are going to have a length equal to the number of system parameters and the number of variance parameters. Okay. The first, if you have, for example, if you have 10 system parameters and 6 variance parameters, the first 10 parameters should correspond to the system parameters, and then everything after that should correspond to the system to the variance parameters. So we have the next field is the guess field, and this is going to be an initial guess, and it's going to be a vector of numeric values, and this is going to be your initial guess for whenever you're doing the parameter estimation. Next, we have a vector of lower bounds. Okay, these are if you don't want any lower bound, you can just set them to negative inf or negative infinity. If you want positive numbers, you can set them to eps. This is epsilon or machine precision. So this is the smallest non-zero number the machine can identify. And if you want to set an upper bound on your parameters, you can set it to inf if you don't want any bound, or you can set them individually to whatever bounds that you want. Okay. The cfg.parameters.system field is just going to take one numeric value, and this is only required if you're using a maximum likelihood objective. Okay, so this is basically telling the optimizer where the system parameters stop and where the variance parameters begin. So if you had 6 system parameters, and if you had 10 system parameters and 6 variance parameters, then this would have a value of 10, representing that, telling the optimizer that that the 10th parameter is the last system parameter. Okay, so in order to control the estimation, we have to tell it, at least minimally, we have to tell it the name of the observation function. Okay, so this is going to be this is the user-defined function that you create, called observation_details.m. That's what it's used as in all of the examples, and until you have a better understanding of what's going on, until you feel comfortable, I would just leave it as the default value of observation_details.m. The last thing that we need to do is we need to tell it the type of objective function to use, either weighted least squares or negative log likelihood. And there's an optional field called timeout, and this is just a numerical value representing the time in seconds after which the estimation routine is going to terminate. So it'll just time out and kind of give up. In order for this to work, you have to type the command tick before calling the optimization routine. So before you run fmin search, if you set a timeout value, you have to type tick before it, and then it uses the MATLAB command inside called talk to determine whether or not it's passed the timeout or not. Tick is an internal MATLAB command. So when we use fmin search, what we're going to do is we're going to tell fmin search to use the function calculate_objective.m to calculate the objective function with respect to changes in parameters that fmin search is going to send into it. In general, you're probably not going to use this function too much by itself, but I'm going to go over its usage with you here anyway. The calculate objective is going to take two inputs, parameters and CFG, in that order, and then it's going to return the value and any details that you might want to add to it. These are optional that you can add, and you can return these values if you want, but you have to return some value. Okay, so with these inputs, the function is going to calculate the objective, and it's going to calculate either the weighted sum squared or the negative log likelihood objective. And so these are going to be determined based on how you specify the objective type. Okay. To obtain the observations, predictions, variances, and weights of the function, it's going to use the function that you specify as the observation function. Keep in mind, by default, this is the observation underscore details.m file that you're going to have to create on your own. Okay. The first value that's going to be returned is the value of the objective function for this given set of parameters. The second value returned contains details about the objective function. So if you want to see more information, you can type help, calculate underscore objective, as long as you're in this ID2 compartment with bolus directory, and it'll return any information and more specifics about this function. Okay, so this should work transparently, and in general it shouldn't require a whole lot of interaction with you. But what you can do is you can call it by itself with the parameters and your CFG variable that you've created in order to test that your observation details function is working correctly. And I would suggest that the first few times you do this, you might want to do that. The solution statistics M file is a function that I created as well, and what this does is it takes as its input a set of parameters and your CFG file. So these parameters are the parameter estimates that are returned by fmin search, and based on these parameter estimates and the CFG file, it's going to return your coefficient of variation, the lower and upper bounds of your confidence interval, the covariance matrix, the number of degrees of freedom, all this information. And if you want more information, you can look at the help for this function as well. This is, to me, the most complicated aspect of this optimization process, or this parameter estimation process, and I tried as best I could to make it simple, but I also wanted to maintain a certain level of flexibility. You may not appreciate the flexibility now, but as you start to perform analyses in MATLAB, you'll appreciate the ability to finely control the observations that are returned. Okay, so the function observation underscore details is this is the user-defined function, and it takes two inputs. The first input is parameters, and the second input is CFG, and they need to be in that order as well. And they return a data structure referred to here as observations. This data structure should have a field for each subject, and I use subject 1, subject 2 for all of those, and each subject output combination. So if you have a subject 1 and an output 1, or a subject 1 and an output 2, should have a matrix. Okay, so there should be a field for each subject, for each output for that subject, and that matrix should contain a column of times representing the observation times. The second column should be a column of observations representing the actual observations. The third column should represent the model predictions for the set of parameters that are sent into this observation underscore details file. And then the last is going to represent your variance model. So these are columns here. So the first column is time, the second column is the actual measured values, the third column are your predicted values according to the model, and then the fourth is some model of your variance. Now, if you just want to use simple sum squared error, then you just set the variance equal to 1. If you want to use inverse, if you want the variance to be equal to the square of your model predictions, you just set it equal to y hat squared. And if you want to do something more complicated, you can define the slope and the intercept based on the system parameters that are the variance parameters that are sent in, and then you can calculate the variance as a model based on your predictions as well. Okay. So for example, if subject 3 only has data for output 2, then you don't need an output 1 field. You only need an output field for the outputs that are present for that individual subject. Okay, so we'll go through some examples of these, but this is basically it. You take a given set of parameters, and based on that set of parameters and any information you've stored in the CFG file, you predict your system forward in time, and you predict it forward in time at the time where you have observations. Then after you've run your model prediction, then you construct this matrix for each subject and output combination that you have. And then these observations are used to calculate objective function values and to calculate solution statistics. Okay, so let's look at analysis.m. Okay, So the first thing that we do in analysis.m is we're going to load the data. So we're going to load data.mat and we're going to pull out of it data and original parameters. Okay. So these data are stored in the data field of the cfg variable. So I take the data that I loaded from data.mat and I take them and I place them in cfg.data. So I'm just sticking them in that variable. Because cfg, keep in mind, is going to be passed from your workspace down into fminsearch. From fminsearch, it's going to be passed into the calculate objective function, and from calculate objective, it's going to be passed down into the observation details file. So this is, you define it here, and then it just passes all the way through. And then I want to store the original parameters somewhere, so I'm going to take my cfg.options field, and I'm going to create a field called original. This is something that I can create as a user, and I'm going to stick in the original parameters. Okay. Next, what we need to do is we need to set the estimate and plot fields. Okay, so these are options that I'm creating, and I'm using these options to control the flow of analysis.m. Okay, so these aren't used anywhere except for in analysis.m, and it's used to control the flow. What this does is it allows me to break my estimation and my plotting up into two different chunks. Okay, so if the field estimate is set to yes, then it's going to perform the parameter estimations, and we'll see how that works in a minute. And if the field plot is set to yes, then it will plot the data for me. Remember that CFG also has to have a parameters field, and this is where we store information about the parameters. So my parameters are going to be VC, K12, K21, and KEL. I'm going to just set my initial guess as all ones because I have no idea what these parameters should be right now. I'm going to set my lower bound at epsilon. This means that they're all going to be positive, and I'm going to set my upper bound at infinity, which means that they can have any upper bound that they want. I need to tell it what type of objective I'm going to have, so I have my objective type set to weighted least squares, and by default, but the standard observation, the function that I use is the observation underscore details.m file. So now the rest of the analysis script has two components. First, we have the component that calculates defines the parameter estimates and calculates the solution statistics, and then the other portion plots the values. Okay, so if we look, we see that if the cfg.options.estimate is set to yes, then it will execute the estimation portion. The estimation portion begins by setting the options. So what I want to do is I want to set the display to display the iterations and set the maximum function evaluations, in this case to 10,000. So I want to try an exhaustive search. Then I call fminsearch and I give it the function handle of calculate objective. Then I give it my initial guess, cfg.parameters.guess. I pass on the options that I defined in the line above, and then I pass on cfg, which is my configuration variable that controls the estimation routines. So when fminsearch is run, it's going to keep going until it finds some estimate of the parameters, and it's going to store that parameter estimate in the parameters variable. Okay, so this is going to be a vector, and the length of this vector is going to be the same as the length of whatever guess I gave it. So it's going to be 4. So in order to bound the parameters internally, the observation, not the observation, in order to bound the parameters, the calculate objective.m file, the function that calculates the objective, truncates your parameters above or below their bounds. So if your parameter goes below the bounds, it's evaluated at the bounds. Okay? Even though fminsearch can send in values that are beyond the bounds of your parameters, they're never evaluated beyond those bounds. But because of this, fminsearch can return values of your parameters beyond the bounds. And also as a result, that means that you need to rebound your parameters after fminsearch gives you the values. So what this does, what this function bound underscore parameters does, is it takes in a vector of parameters, some lower bounds and the upper bounds, and it returns the bounded parameters. And those are the actual values that were used to calculate your objective at the last iteration. Or actually, yeah, at the last iteration, fmin search ran. So after we bounded our parameters, then we calculate the solution statistics. So the solution statistics takes in our bounded parameters and our CFG variable, and then it returns solution stats. Okay. Next, what we do is we save all this information. So we save the estimation solution into the estimation solution.mat file. We're going to save the parameters, the solution statistics, and I also like to save this CFG file, just so that I can, if I have questions about the analysis that I ran, it's all stored in that CFG file as well. So that was the first portion. That was the estimation portion of analysis.m. Next, if the cfg.options.plot variable is set to yes, that means that it's going to execute the plotting portion. The first thing that we do is we load the estimation solution, we load the parameters, and we're also loading the solution statistics. So we're not overriding the CFG variable. It's going to stay as whatever it was specified at the top of the script. The reason why this is useful is we can run the estimation routine in one go, and then we can change the cfg.options.estimate to no, or some non-yes value, and then we can run the plotting routine over and over again so that we can fine-tune our plotted output for either presentations or publications or just showing it to our advisors. So the first thing we have to do is we have to load those saved solutions. So we load estimation under solution.mat. We're going to load the parameters and the solution statistics. Next, what we do, or what I've done, is I have this function that I've created called generate report, and what it does is it will generate the a report that contains your solution statistics. You have to give it parameters, solution stats, and CFG, and then it'll create the file called report.txt. Okay, so report.txt will contain this information, and then right here, then at line 95, it just types that, so it just prints it to the screen within MATLAB. Now, what you could do is you can open it up. It's a text file, and then you can print it out if you want to a file, or you can email it to somebody. So what we have next is I go through and I plot everything. So here we have the original data given by the circles. We have my initial parameter estimate. Remember, I started my initial guess off at all ones because I just didn't know what the solution was. And I actually have the actual values, and those are given, the prediction according to the actual values are given by the solid black line, and then the blue dash dot line shows my model prediction at the estimated values. And here I have the original values and the estimates, and the original values and the estimates. Next, I have the report.txt file. We have the variance covariance matrix. We have the estimate, the parameter estimate, the lower bound, the upper bound, and then we have the coefficient of variation as a percent. So you have the percent CV. Okay, so now let's look at the actual analysis file, and we'll run it within MATLAB. I've discussed all these components already, but we'll go through them again. I'm clearing the data, and then I'm compiling my model. I like to do this every time, like I said. Next, I load the data from the file, and I've actually created a file to generate these data, but I'm not running that here. I'm just going to load the data, and then I store that data in the CFG variable, and then I also store the original parameters. Next, I'm going to set these two options to yes. So I'm saying that I want to run the estimation, and then I also want to run the plotting. Then I define the parameters fields. So we have the names, we have the initial guess, we have the lower bound, and we have the upper bound. Then I tell it then I have to fill out the estimation fields of CFG. So I tell it the objective type, and I tell it the observation function. Next, I come down here. This is the estimation portion, right? So this is where I'm estimating my parameters, and basically strcmp compares the string stored in CFG options estimate with yes, and if they're the same, then this condition is true, and the code below this is then executed. So if I change this to something not yes, like say ness, or no, or if I just set it to nothing, then if I set it to nothing, or if I change it to something that's not yes, then this condition will not be true, and then the estimation portion will not be run. But I'm going to change it back to yes. Let's go back to the estimation portion. Here I'm setting my options for fmin search, and then I'm going to run fmin search. Okay. Remember, the objective function is called calculate objective. My initial guess is stored in cfg.parameters.guess. My options were defined before, and the CFG was defined above. Remember, I said that fmin search can return values beyond your bounds, but those values were actually evaluated at your bounds for determining the objective function. So we need to rebound the parameters here. And then we take our bounded parameters and we calculate our solution statistics using the solution statistics m file that I created. And I stored that all in the solution stats variable. And then I save everything into estimate_solution.mat. I'm going to save parameters, solution stats, and I'm going to save the CFG file, or the CFG variable. Next we have the plotting. So basically I have, I'm doing a string compare on cfg.options.plot. If this is equal to yes, then we'll run the plotting portion. And this should look a lot like your simulation driver from before. I define my ODE simulation as my model name. I define my simulation options. I define my initial condition. I define the bolus that's going into it. Then I close all the figures. I open a figure. I turn hold on. I calculate. I set the output times to go from 0 to the maximum sample time. And I tell it to have 1,000 increments so that it'll be a smooth and continuous output profile. And then I run my simulation, but I run it first with the original parameters, and I store those in SimOut_orig. So I'm using the actual original parameters that I stored above here. And then I load from my solution. I load my solution parameters and my solution statistics. And I run, and then I go through and I redefine my bolus options, and then I run my simulation again, and this is going to be stored in SimOut_est. So this is my solution based according to my parameter estimates. And so parameters here was actually loaded from the data file here. And I have my simulation options, which are the same as above. Next, what I do is I generate my report. So this generates the report, and then it types it to the screen. And then I'm going to also, just for fun, I'm going to run my simulation at the guess. I just go ahead and redefine my bolus values here, and I'm going to run my simulation at the original guess. So this is going to evaluate the simulation at my original guess to show you how far off I was or how far away I started. And then I go through and I plot my my original parameters, I plot the predictions for my original parameters, the predictions for the estimates, and the predictions for the guess. And then I go ahead and plot all of the data as well. Next, I use Boulder to make it thicker, and then I go through and I do some labeling, and then I dump it all to a file. Okay. And then down here, I'm actually writing values to a file, but we don't need to be concerned about that. Okay. So that is the estimation routine, and that is the plotting routine. Now I can run this. I can type analysis and hit enter, and it'll chug away. The first thing it's doing now is it's compiling my model. The first time I compile a model, it always seems to take a little longer, but subsequently, after it's loaded all the different variables, or the different libraries, I suppose, it goes along quicker. Now it's running the function estimation routine. So we can see now it ran the estimation routine, and it eventually minimized the objective function value. it came to some sort of solution criteria. These are the default values. Here are the then it prints the estimates and the different solution statistics to the screen. So here are the estimates, the confidence intervals, the coefficient of variation, the variance covariance matrix, and then other useful information. And then I also had it print these values as well because I was interested in how the originals compared to the estimates. And then it generates this figure here where we have the estimate, and the initial guess. So the next example I want to do is one that I pulled from the ADAPT manual, and it's identification of a system where you have a parent and a metabolite. So this is the over here we see the model to the right, and on the left we see the different equations that are used. So there's 3 differential equations, there's 2 different outputs, and then we have 2 different models of variance, or the same model of variance applied to the 2 different outputs. The input here is an infusion of 100 units from time 0 to 1, and so we have basically 6 system parameters and 2 variance parameters. So this is an example of how to use the negative log likelihood option. So I pulled the data out of the ADAPT manual and I stuck it in an array. And so if you look at analysis.m and the id_parent_metabolite directory, you'll see that the first 6 to 15 lines there are just the ADAPT data that have been cut and pasted into this file. Then what I do is I take these data and I stick them into I stick them into my cfg.data field, and I create a field for the time, for the parent, and the metabolite. So column 1 here are the time values, column 2 here are the parent values, and column 3 here are the metabolite values. Now what we do is we take the we need to specify some other information. In this case, because we're using we're going to want to use the maximum likelihood, or the negative log likelihood objective function. We need to tell it that there are 6 system parameters. Then we need to specify the names of the parameters. So we have the KP, the VP, the K12, K21, KM, VMFM, and then we have our 2 variance parameters, M1 and M2. We also need to specify that we're using the negative log likelihood or maximum likelihood objective function. And basically the rest of analysis.m is going to work essentially the same as it did in the previous example. We have a section where we're performing estimation, and we have a section where we're generating our figures to plot the results. Now let's look at the observation details file. So here we have the observation details file that takes as its input params and CFG, and it's going to give us back observations. So what we need to do is we're going to basically construct the simulation options data structure, where we specify the model name, the initial condition of our system, and then we specify our infusion rates. This is just like we did in the previous section where we were trying to specify infusion rates. We create a field called infusion rates. There's only one of them, so we tell it, so it's the first one. We give it a name, and we specify the levels. So it's going to start at time 0, and it's going to jump up to 100, and then at time 1, it's going to jump back down to 0. Now, this is important because in this example, our output times don't actually begin. Now, you can look at the data, but they don't actually begin at time 0. If you look back, you'll see that the first output time is actually at 0.5, right? But our infusion begins at time 0. So if we tell it the output times are only going to correspond to our data, then we'll miss the first half hour of infusion. So we have to give it a time 0 output time even though we don't have data at that point. Okay, so that's what this is. We've created a dummy initial, because this is when the initial condition is going to apply, and this is when the infusion rate is going to begin as well. So one thing that you need to understand is that when we're performing parameter estimation, the optimizer can send in combinations of parameters that are going to hang the system. Okay, and it means that basically the integrator will keep integrating, but the steps the integrator is taking are so small that it can just take forever to integrate the system forward in time. So what I've done here is I've specified that I want a timeout value of 20. So basically, I believe this is a 20-second timeout. So if it takes longer than 20 seconds to integrate the system forward in time, it'll time out. Okay. What's going to happen is if this fails, then the calculated objective will identify that observation details failed at that set of parameters, and then it'll return a value of infinity. Okay, and so what that's going to do is that's going to push fmin search away from that parameter combination. Okay, so these system of equations have been written robustly to sort of catch these failures and to kind of route around them. Okay, now because they are routing around them, you know, if you make a typo in observation details and observation details just dies, then what's going to happen is that the calculate objective function will then keep returning infinity, infinity, infinity. So because it's written robustly, if you make a mistake, then it's going to be interpreted as an objective function failure. Okay, so there are certain implications when you make a programming error. It's going to be determined as a bad set of parameters. So it's very important to test your observation details file by sending in a value of parameters in CFG to make sure that it's actually returning what you expect. Okay, and as you become more comfortable with MATLAB, you're probably going to make fewer and fewer mistakes. But at the very beginning, when you create an observation details file, it's very important that you test it, you know, just from the command line, or you can test it from your analysis file at the very beginning to make sure it's spitting out the correct information. Okay. So after we've created our simulation options and we've got our params that were sent into this file, we're going to run our simulation. So we run it and then we store the information in sim output. Now remember that our times have an extra time, right? So we have our observation times and we also have time 0, but we have no observations at time 0. So what we need to do is we need to remove the first observation time, and we also need to remove all of the states and outputs that correspond to that as well. So that's what lines 20 through 22 do. 20, 21, and 22, they basically just take your vectors from time 2, the second time, to the end, and they basically overwrite your vectors with the originals from time 2 to the end. That's what this is doing. So I'm removing that dummy time that I stuck in. Now we need to calculate our variances. So I basically create these two different parameters, or these two different variables called M1 and M2. Basically, param 7 and 8 store our variance parameters. And then I calculate the variance, var1 and var2, based on the simulation output and the variance parameters. Next, I need to create our observations. So I create observations.subject1.output1, and I give it the vector of times, the vector of data, this is where the parent is, the model predictions for the parent, and the variance for the parent. Then I give it the same output times, the data for the metabolite, the model predictions for the metabolite, and the modeled variance for the metabolite. Now keep in mind that all of our times, all of our data, and all of our model predictions and our variances, these are all columns, so I can just put them here the way they are. Now you need to make sure that the dimensionality is correct as well. So if for example, your data were stored as rows, then you would have to put a single quote after parent in order to convert that row into a column. So here we have the initial guess, the final estimates, and then the data that were used to generate the data that were fitted. Okay. See, one thing that you might want to note is that the initial guess for these parameters produce a profile that's very, very similar to the actual value. So one question you might have is, what do you do when you have a situation where you don't have any good initial guess? Okay, and I've got, if you go to the advanced topic selection, and you can follow the link here, or you can look at the slide number on your handouts, and you can go there, and I have an example of where I've kind of automated the process of moving around the search space and trying to find a better initial guess and honing in on the final solution in the event that I don't have a very good initial guess. This is sort of my my overview on parameter estimation. Basically, what you want to do is you want to begin by creating the files you need to simulate your system. Okay, this is basically why we covered the simulation portion. Okay, once you have your system simulating forward in time, you want to be able to simulate your system forward in time and evaluate your system at the place where you have observations. This is what observation details is. Okay. So we simulate the system forward in time at the place where you have observations. Then we have to construct the observations data structure. Remember, you can test observation details from either the command window or from some script to ensure that it's performing the way that you want it to. Next, you need to modify the analysis script, and you need to store your data someplace. You need to add or change your parameters. You need to control. You need to change the estimation routines, and then you need to change the aspects associated with plotting and generating results.